And welcome to everybody who's signed in today. We really appreciate your attendance and hopefully you get something out of this. So as Louis said, I'm going to talk about the 5 factors of nitrogen loss and ways to minimise nitrogen leaching from your farm. But before we do that, I'll just give a brief purpose of the webinar. We're going to give a brief outline, first of all, of the Healthy Rivers Plan Change 1. Now, this provides a good framework for why we will talk about nitrogen leaching today. However, the main focus is on the drivers of nitrogen leaching and the ways to reduce it. With the Healthy Rivers Plan Change, you'll see a whole lot of new terminology coming along. 75th percentile, timelines, nitrogen reference points, compliance, consents, and so on. And it's about these we'll talk about and why you need to reduce your nitrogen losses. Nitrogen in Healthy Rivers under Plan Change 1, PC1, well, actually under the National Policy on Freshwater Management, councils are actually required to set policy to manage water quality. And this is around nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment and fecal coliforms. They actually have to set policy, and this is just one of the many councils doing it. Regulation is expanding, and it's expanding very quickly. In 2017, you can see on the left-hand side picture of New Zealand, the areas which had some form of regulation in place around either nitrogen, phosphorus, or both. We haven't included Healthy Rivers there because it's still under a submission. In 2025, we expect just about all of the country to have some form of regulation in place. It's 75% of all of New Zealand. So it's coming, and it's coming quickly. Under Plan Change 1, all farms in the Healthy Rivers catchment have to register with the council and submit their nitrogen reference point by the 31st of March 2019. It's only just over a year away. And nutrient management plans, or farm environment plans, with several names, will be required in following years, depending on what priority region you're in. And all of this can be found on the Healthy Rivers website, which we'll give a link to later. Understanding the drivers of nitrogen leaching and how to reduce it is actually essential for developing a useful nutrient management plan. And as I said, we'll send out a link to the Healthy Rivers website to find out more information. Right, into the nitty-gritty, the drivers of nitrogen leaching and ways to minimise nitrogen leaching losses. There are 5 main factors of nitrogen loss. We start at the top of the circle. We've got animal influences, effluent, and we're talking about effluent that you've collected either in the farm dairy or from a feed pad, a wintering pad, or an animal shelter. Fertiliser nitrogen and its impacts. Feed supply, that's mainly bought-in feed, but also considering annual crops you may have grown, such as kale or fodder beet, or even annual rye. And drainage, and here we'll be talking about natural soil drainage, not artificial drainage, but natural soil drainage. Animals, you'll see there's a word cloud here. The bigger and bolder the word, the more important it is for this particular factor. So for animals, and most of you will have heard about this by now, urine is the single largest source of nitrogen for leaching on a dairy farm. Up to 80% of your nitrogen can come directly from urine patches. And that's because you've got a high amount of nitrogen in a urine patch and a high amount of liquid relative to rainfall. So you've got up to 800 to 1,000 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare equivalent and up to 10 mils of water equivalent in depth applied. High concentrations, high amount of water driving drainage. Animal breed, bigger the animals, the more urine. High protein feeds, the more protein in the diet, the more nitrogen in the diet, and actual stocking rate are all drivers of nitrogen leaching as well. But urine is the largest single factor. So what can we do about it? You see on the slice of land coming out, there's some graphics there. On the right-hand side, we've got some cows and reduced stocking rate there. The most unpalatable for most farmers is that has a direct impact on your production and income. But reducing stocking rate is one of the biggest ways to reduce nitrogen leaching. But you can do that by other ways other than just reducing cow numbers. You can use time-limited grazing. That's getting the cows off the pasture and then collecting that effluent and spreading it back over, much as you do with your farm dairy effluent. And in that way, you're utilising a feed pad, and also animal housing is another function as well, and wintering pads to get them off the pasture and then collect that effluent. Using lower protein feeds, such as maize silage compared to palm kernel experience. So if you're already using a lot of supplement on farm, and a lot of it's PKE, then perhaps you could consider using maize silage. Wintering off is another one. Just getting those cows off the farm to a runoff block or to a grazier will actually also reduce your nitrogen leaching, because you're getting those animals off during a period of high drainage. Just need to click that over. There we go. Effluent. So now we'll talk about effluent. So too much effluent on a small area is the biggest source of driving nitrogen leaching on your farm from effluent. So it's that too much of it. Composition is also another driver, and also wet pastures. And so that's wet pastures, we mean the soils are wet up and it can put an effluent on top, can run off into streams or waterways, or potentially leach straight down through the macropores in the soil. But too much on a small area is the single biggest driver here. What can we do about it? There's quite a lot of things on this slice of land there. Applying a water deficit is a good idea on the right-hand side there, because you've got drier soils and the soils will wet up but not necessarily drain through as quickly. But be aware that if it's too dry and you're close to a stream or a drain, you could cause some runoff and have effluent runoff directly into the waterway. Clearly, increasing your effluent block area is a good way to go often. In this example, we've increased effluent block area by 10% to 15%, and you can achieve some good gains by doing that often. Bearing in mind the council regulations on 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year applied via effluent. We can also use low rate application. That's where you reduce the amount your irrigator is putting on in a pass and cover more area each day. However, that means you'll have to have more passes over your effluent block throughout the year than you normally do. You can export your effluent off farm, and I've dealt with a couple of farms throughout the country where they actually do that. They truck it or pipe it to a runoff block. They can pipe it if it's right next door, or truck it over and spread it via tanker onto a runoff or somebody else's property who's willing to buy it. One farm did that to increase the fertility on another farm that they had bought, because the fertility was quite low. But you've got to be wary that you're actually moving nutrients, not just nitrogen, but phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sulfur, etc., off farm as well, and they may need to be replaced by fertiliser nutrients. And timing of applications. Time your applications for when there's the least risk of runoff and the greatest chance of uptake by your plants. So you want to be applying it from spring, when plants are growing fast, and through summer, when there is less drainage occurring, and early autumn. From mid-autumn on through winter, we're getting drainage increasing and getting to its greatest, and also pasture growth rates are slowing down, so they're taking up less of that nitrogen out of the soil. Fertiliser nitrogen. Here, as you can see, applying it at the wrong time is the crucial point here. Typically, we don't get very much direct leaching of nitrogen from fertiliser, but if you apply it at the wrong time and in the wrong place or too much of it, you can get some nitrogen leaching from that fertiliser. So what can we do about it? We can consider a slow-release nitrogen product, and we've got a polymer-coated nitrogen product which releases nitrogen over 3 months of the year. So you can apply your nitrogen on and it will release it slowly. And that's good for when you want some early spring growth and need to apply nitrogen through the late autumn or winter. Following good management practice is essential, and I've no doubt that you're all doing that now. And that's simply to avoid your waterways, avoid your risky periods of runoff or drainage occurring as in winter, and making sure your rates aren't too high. Applying little and often, and not just applying the same amount straight after the cows, for instance, have gone, and doing the feed budget to make sure you actually do need your nitrogen that's going on, planning ahead. And applying in suitable weather, such as when runoff is not likely to occur or drainage is not likely to occur. And that's again back to those timings around your spring, winter, summer and early autumn.
There's a big focus on leaching from dairy farms. What about urban areas? They pump loads of sewage into the rivers, don't they?
Yep, that's dead right. And it's a really good question and is of major concern for a lot of people out there. And not just the rural, but the urban people are quite concerned as well. With the urban areas, and I'll include factories such as the meatworks and the milk companies who discharge into the rivers, they have consents to discharge, which come up for renewal every so often. I'm not clear on how often those are. They can vary depending on the consent itself. And they have very intensive monitoring and tough conditions. They are allowed to discharge under extreme circumstances, but there are penalties if they breach their conditions. It's quite a tricky one because we can see them at times discharging into the waterways, but that's all factored in, and the Healthy Rivers program took into account all of the urban and impacts and factory impacts on the waterways, and it's regularly monitored, and the consents come up for renewal with very strict conditions attached to them. Any more questions, Louise?
Yep. So the next one is, if you winter your cows off farm, aren't you just moving the problem to somewhere else?
Okay. Yeah, I've heard this quite a lot, and yes, you can be moving a problem. But we have to bear in mind, if you're moving your cows off to someone else's property or to a runoff block, that runoff block or the other person's property will also be subjected to rules and regulations that they have to meet. So long as their farming system has factored that in, and it's part of their farming system, personally, I don't believe you're moving a problem. What you can do as a farmer, if you're concerned about this, is to talk with your grazier or have a look at your own runoff block or somebody else's that you may be leaching, and make sure that the farm your animals are going to, that the nitrogen leaching from that farm does comply with any regulations that may be enforced on that property. Thank you, Louise.
And a final one, what if I stop using urea and use DAP instead? Will that help to reduce nitrogen leaching?
If you stopped using urea and started using DAP, no, it won't necessarily do that as long as if you're using the same amount of nitrogen, because it's a form of nitrogen that is not the issue here. What nitrogen does, as I mentioned briefly, it grows more pasture or crops, and then the animals eat that and then convert a lot into produce, such as milk, or on a dry stock farm, it'd be meat or wool, and urinate as well, and that urine is the biggest factor of nitrogen loss. So at this stage, there's no evidence to show that using DAP instead of urea will reducing nitrate leaching. It's really the timing and rate of application that drives direct leaching from nitrogen fertiliser, and also the animals grazing that. Thanks, Louise.
And I'll just remind you all, just if you've got any questions, make sure you type them in. We're keen to answer them for you.
Right, we'll move on to feed, animal feed, and this encompasses the crops that you may feed, including annuals, and the supplements you bring into the farm system. So with feed, the biggest source here is that protein content of the feed. The more protein in that feed, the more nitrogen in that feed. So the more nitrogen that's floating around in the system on farm, and the more nitrogen that can get into the animal urine. With crops, however, you'll find that winter grazing and strip grazing of those crops are big sources or big point sources of nitrogen leaching on farm. Winter grazing, because you're grazing them during a period of high risk of drainage and runoff, and also strip grazing because of the concentration of animals with urine patch on top of urine patch. So what can we do about that? This graphic dictates mainly around your protein feeds that you've brought into the farm. And so in using a feed pad or a wintering pad or an animal shelter, for instance, where you can feed that supplement out into a trough where the animals can utilise it better, is a good way to go. What that means is you often need to bring in less of that feed. So that's reducing the total amount of nitrogen in the system. You can look at using a lower protein feed, such as maize silage, which is around 8% crude protein, and so much less nitrogen. Or compared to, say, palm kernel, which has about 14% protein in it. Improving pasture utilisation. And the way that will work is that if you can improve the pasture utilisation on farm, there's less wastage. So you then need to bring in less supplementary feed. And so, again, less nitrogen in the whole system. With winter grazing of crops, if we can avoid doing that, that will help a lot as well. If we can grow another crop, summer crop, which has been popular in the past, and then pushing your pasture feed forward like a feed wedge. So you've got that to graze throughout the winter. And that works by spreading the animals out over the pasture. Instead of grazing 300 cows on a small area of crop, you've got 300 cows over 2 or 3 paddocks or more. And strip grazing is the same effect as well. Trying to minimise that so that you haven't got the concentration of animals in the same area. Soil drainage. Now here I'm talking about natural soil drainage and the impacts of natural soil drainage on leaching, on nitrogen leaching. Soil structure is the key here. With very well-structured soils with big macro pores and plenty of other pores in the soil, you'll get drainage through that soil. Brilliant soil for growing grass, but often causes a lot of drainage and nitrogen leaching. Sandier and stonier and gravelier your soils, that'll cause problems as well, as there's water can drain out quickly through those profiles. And soil type, your glazed, your clay soils have a lower leaching value than your sandy soils, etc. And rainfall, of course. The more rain you get, the more drainage you're going to get and the more leaching. What can we do about it? Unfortunately, not a lot. If you've got water irrigation, of which there are a few people irrigating with water throughout the Greater Waikato, you can look at managing that water so that you're only watering up to field capacity or just below field capacity, and making sure then that the pasture plants are growing and you're not having excess water around. With effluent irrigation, sure, we're putting on a bit of water, but usually it's quite minimal and only 2 or 3 times a year that's going on, compared to with water irrigators, it's going to be 2 or 3 times a month. So there's not a lot you can do there. It is what it is. But that's the key drivers there. It is right. Okay. I thought we were going to get more questions from me there, Louise, but I was wrong. Okay, so how can we at Ballance help you? How can we help you? Well, we've got the Farm Sustainability Services team available. They're very experienced, and when you're doing your nitrogen reference point, they can do that for you. And they're regionally based. We've got a team over at the Mount, and we've got somebody in the Waikato just recently started to do that. And the other team is based in Ashburton with somebody in Otago for your interest. We've also got some tools to help. We use Overseer, the nutrient budget model, which is available to anybody to use. And that's used for getting your nitrogen reference point. And then we've got 2 other tools to help you manage your nutrients, not just nitrogen, on farm. Mitigator, which will come on stream later this year, and that can help you find suitable mitigations to reduce nitrogen leaching and look at some of the impacts of those on your farm. And Nguru, which is a nitrogen management tool, helping you to grow the same amount of grass for less nitrogen or more grass for the same amount of nitrogen by targeting specific areas on your farm based on soil type. So in summary, councils have to set policy to manage water quality. They don't have a choice. Animals have the greatest impact on nitrogen loss to water, and that's via urine as the greatest single driver. And as I said earlier, up to 80% of nitrogen leached on a dairy farm can come from the urine patch. And each farm is different, and not all mitigations will suit all farms. And we're not trying to tell you to do any one of these mitigations, but just to give you some idea of what's available. And there are no silver bullets. There are several mitigations may be needed to meet your in-loss targets. You may not get away with just 1 or 2. And always obtain professional advice before you embark on putting a mitigation in, which may cause you to have to spend a lot of money, because you want to make sure you're getting the best bang for your buck. And Ballance has the tools and the people to help. So here we are, some questions now.
Yes, so we've got a few more questions here, Ian, for you. What about using a feed pad? That will reduce nitrogen leaching, won't it?
Use a feed pad. Yes, it can help reduce nitrogen leaching, but we've got to remember that it's how you manage that effluent that you collect from the feed pad that really counts. So you've got to collect it and spread it out over a wider area so that you're not going to actually increase leaching, because if you don't do that, you can increase leaching. The other trick is you've spent a lot of money, and often it's tempting to actually increase cow numbers to help pay for the feed pad, and that will also increase your leaching off your farm. And don't apply heaps to a crop. Make sure you apply it at suitable rates so that you're not over applying the nitrogen. Otherwise you can increase nitrogen leaching as well from that feed pad effluent. Thank you, Louise.
And the next one is, if I import a lot of low protein feed, does that mean I have to become a System 5 farm with a lot of infrastructure costs?
No, you don't have to. What I was more referring to there is people who are already using a lot of supplementary feed, bringing it in, and maybe looking at changing the type of feed from a higher protein feed to a lower protein feed. But if you are considering bringing in supplement, also look at that as well, and look at the protein content of that feed. But once again, it would be useful to get some professional advice around the protein, the nutrient requirements of your animals and the feed supply, so that make sure that you're not going to impinge on their production. Any more questions, Louise?
And a final one for you. If I put in drains, such as mole or tile drains, will that reduce nitrogen leaching?
Yeah. Oh, really good question, Louise. Yeah, and we often put in drains and often tile drains, even open drains, to take that water away under areas which are quite wet, typically wet and boggy. But what that does is, when you put in an artificial drain, is it takes the water away from the plants quickly and before they can utilise it and take that nitrogen out of that product. And it also reduces attenuation, which is the binding up essentially of that nitrogen into other products which don't leach in the soils. So it takes it away very quickly and deposits it into a waterway, and this can actually exacerbate the nitrogen leaching from your property. Thanks, Louise.
Yep, that's all I've got for now.
Okay, so thanks for joining us, guys.